The U.S. Woodland pattern. If you know about camouflage or military uniforms, you'll know about its significance. Even for people who don't, they'll likely be familiar and associate it with just the word camouflage. Plainly put, it's perhaps the most common and recognizable camouflage pattern out there. But what happens when a pattern becomes so widely used, familiar, and recreated? What happens if one nation's military and the enemy they're fighting have access to the same or similar patterns simply because they're so common? Well, we'll be looking at one such scenario and the somewhat controversial and heavily scrutinized action done to rectify it. Today, we'll be covering the Spec4ce Afghan forest pattern used by the Afghan National Army. Around mid-2017, various news outlets picked up on a developing story on how the US government had unnecessarily spent close to $30 million in order to outfit the Afghan National Army, ANA for short, with new camouflage uniforms. Coming off the heels of the debacle that was the US Army's universal camouflage pattern, the media was quick to cry foul when word came out more wasteful spending was done related to a military camouflage. Although this is in a way technically true, there is a lot more to it than that. So let's start from the beginning. In late 2001, the United States initiated Operation Enduring Freedom, which encompassed the invasion of Afghanistan and the start of hostilities against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and their allies. After the dust had settled, the United States had agreed to assist the Afghan people rebuild its government, infrastructure, economy, and for this story, military. And so the US began to slowly help with the training, restructuring, and re-equipping of the National Army. Between 2002 and 2007, in addition to numerous locally sourced patterns, Afghan forces received a number of donated gear from various coalition and non-coalition nations, which included numerous camouflage patterns such as US 3-color desert, commercially made desert tiger stripe, woodland marpat copies, and most significantly various woodland patterns with origins from Iran, Turkey, and the US. However, as reorganizing continued, their primary camouflage uniform quickly became one that was very reminiscent of US woodland BDUs. For a time this worked, however an issue arose. This pattern, being that it, and copies of it, had been circulated throughout the region as early as 1996 to the Northern Alliance, meant that it was easily obtained. In fact, Osama bin Laden was seen in many photos and videos wearing a US M65 field jacket in the same woodland pattern. And so it wasn't long until Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters were able to infiltrate ANA installations and units. So around 2007, the Afghan Ministry of Defense, or MOD, began the task of seeking out a new distinct uniform and pattern to modernize, unify, and most importantly, ensure a heightened level of security for their forces. With the help of CSTC-A, or the Combined Security Transition Command Afghanistan, a US-led multinational force established in 2006 to oversee and assist the Afghan government with a variety of things financially, in this case its armed forces, the MOD ended up selecting a pattern known at the time simply as Spec4ce Forest, created by Hyperstealth Biotechnology Corporation, or simply Hyperstealth for short. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the company as it has made a name for itself by creating and offering a massive selection of camouflage patterns, many of which can be classified as digital to various nations as well as to the public through various commercial endeavors. The pattern they chose, spelled like this, was initially part of a camouflage family that started with 5 other variants, which were woodland, tropical, desert dune, urban, and metro. Shortly after, an additional 17 were announced as a part of Series 2, most of which were allowed for commercial purchase directly through Hyperstealth. Originally created by CEO Guy Kramer and Dr. Timothy O'Neill, who led the development team behind the United States Marine Corps MARPAT camouflage, Spec4ce came about while they were developing the pattern SOPAT, or Special Operations Pattern. Generally, the design incorporates the macro elements seen in CADPAT and MARPAT, i.e. its overall design, and blends it with the fader pixels of Spec4ce, all while using an unused research element called symmetry axis disruption, which means the pattern is broken up, resulting in fewer repeats of the design. The pattern also takes advantage of color differentials and various other techniques, but it gets a bit technical, so if you want to read a full breakdown of the pattern from its co-creator Guy Kramer himself, you can find a link in the description. description. Anyway, this pattern was first announced on HyperStealth's website back in February of 2006, and by May 2007, the pattern, as well as uniform specifications, had been approved by the MOD as well as CSTC-A. By the end of 2009, the first batches of uniforms started to find their way into ANA hands. So what was this new uniform? Well, essentially it was an ACU-inspired cut. These specifications essentially boiled down to the uniform going from a BDU with a US Woodland pattern to one that was closer to an ACU one with the new Spec4ce's Forest. Sounds pretty reasonable, right? Well, some thought so, others not so much. It's essentially here the controversy surrounding this camouflage sort of splits into three categories: the overall cost of the uniform, the decision to select a camouflage that would require a licensing fee, and the adoption of a Woodland camouflage for a force operating in a predominantly arid country. So let's tackle the uniform cut issue first. The ACU cut incorporates a number of extra pockets as well as traditional BDU-style buttons, Velcro closures, and newer, more reliable fabric. The material Spec4ce is printed on is 50/50 NICO, or nylon cotton, which incorporates ripstop capabilities as well as longer protection against color fading, and perhaps most importantly limits the amount of melting and dripping when exposed to fire. Compare that to certain older BDUs and you find yourself with cotton or a nylon and polycotton blend, which often didn't feature ripstop, faded and wore out quickly, and burned easily. So, this overall increased the cost of the uniform, not only because of the various new components, but also because of time to manufacture them as well. Through January 2017, 1,364,602 uniforms, along with an extra 88,010 pairs of pants, were ordered and created for the Afghan National Army, costing nearly $94 million US. HyperStealth's Guy Kramer and even the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or SIGAR for short, identified the cut changes as a contributing factor for the inflated cost. HyperStealth went even further to point out that they were only receiving royalties for the pattern by the yard, and that the cost of the licensing and the ACU-style cut manufacturing were lumped together, which makes the overall expense a much higher figure. In the SIGAR report, you can even see how they average the total unit cost, that being a single uniform, of the Afghan National Army, the Border Police, local police, and uniform police. If you take their uniforms from that time and put them side by side, you'll see that the Army was the only one with an ACU-style cut, the other three being closer in style to BDUs, often in a solid color, which drastically reduced the overall cost. This brings us to the issue of licensing. Since HyperStealth was being paid a royalty, many were quick to ask why a non-proprietary, in this case a government-owned pattern, wasn't considered. In the SIGAR report, they listed a number of patterns available, which can be seen here. Obviously, the Woodland and ERDL would be out of the question, as would any snow patterns. In addition, it was stated that coalition member patterns could also have been acquired for adoption. These weren't the entirety of the options, as they could have drawn from many patterns owned by the US government, new or old, save for obvious ones like UCP or MARPAT. When defending the cost of the licensing fee, Kramer compared and contrasted it to the US Army's licensing of multicam, known as OEF-CP, from Cry Precision, which was happening around the same time. He said when put up against one another, the licensing fee per uniform for multicam was 323% higher than that of a uniform with the Spec4ce's pattern. And when they switched to Scorpion W2, which was co-created by Cry Precision in 2002, the royalty fees totaled 17% more per uniform. However, according to SIGAR, it would have cost Natick Labs $156,400 and 22 weeks to either ready an old or develop a new pattern for Afghan forces, or $420,400 and 14 months to independently develop a new one. Granted, one could argue that the 2008 field trials with the US Army shows these are conservative figures, but there would have likely been less bureaucracy and hoops to jump through in those situations. Regardless of the cost, the MOD had chosen the pattern, and this decision can be best summed up by a CSTC-A official who stated, "They have already chosen the pattern they want. We cannot and will not pick for them." Strangely enough though, when John Sopko, the Special Inspector General of SIGAR, testified before the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, he said the following.
It appears that CSTC-A only showed the Afghan Minister of Defense proprietary camouflage patterns owned by one company, a Canadian company called HyperStealth.
This lands us to the third and perhaps most significant controversy, the pattern being a Woodland one. When you think of Afghanistan, what do you think of as far as terrain? Arid, rocky, mountainous, dusty? Well, in a large way, yes, but not entirely. Many found the quick decision in picking a green-dominant camouflage pattern as a hasty and short-sighted one, citing how a majority of the country is arid. In addition, the lack of testing was seen as a major issue, as the selection of the pattern is often simplified to then Defense Minister Abdul Rahim Wardak, skimming through the internet and finding a pattern he found cool. This is so much so that John Sopko expressed his view on the matter by saying, "My concern is, what if the Minister of Defense liked purple or liked pink? Are we going to buy pink uniforms for soldiers and not ask questions? That's insane. This is just simply stupid on its face. We wasted $28 million of taxpayers' money in the name of fashion because the defense minister thought that that pattern was pretty. So if he thought pink or chartreuse was it, would we have done that?" However, there are some slightly hidden merits behind this pattern. First is that it is treated with infrared coating, meaning it does not glow when seen through night vision devices, making it rather effective in the dark. This is a benefit as ANA forces have slowly begun operating more frequently at night. The second is a bit more directed at it being a woodland camouflage used in a desert environment. Let's take a look at a map and break down the geography and environments of Afghanistan. 2.1% of the overall country is made up of forests. However, forests are not technically woodlands. A forest is often considered more densely packed with vegetation like trees, shrubs, and plants in general, which results in thicker canopies and an overall darker and more packed appearance, while woods, or in this case woodlands, are more sparse with vegetation that is more widely spread out, allowing for gaps and open areas such as valleys, meadows, and so on. With that in mind, the ANA woodland pattern would be effective in both of those locations. So let's take a look at that map again with both forests and woodlands highlighted. As you can see, a larger percentage of the country falls into those classifications. Well, this was a point made by Hyperstealth when defending the pattern. They went on to mention that many Marine units in the Helmand River Valley began using woodland marpat instead of desert. Regardless, when the US Congress passed the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act in late 2017, the pattern was brought up in the form of Section 344, titled Cost-Benefit Analysis of Uniform Specifications for Afghan Military or Security Forces. It essentially required that the pattern be investigated to see if there was a better alternative as far as operational environments it would be found in, as well as cost, test the effectiveness of their pattern stacked up against ones owned by the US government, and determine the total cost to transition the ANA to a uniform made of a non-proprietary pattern, as well as figure out the cost to acquire the rights to Spec4ce's Forest from Hyperstealth. And so a study was conducted by a West Point Military Academy professor the following year, testing out the pattern stacked up against 6 other US government-owned patterns, which were US Woodland, the very same pattern Spec4ce's Forest replaced, Desert, Urban, and Forest all over brush, which were part of an experimental camouflage family seen during the US Army Universal Camouflage Trials, then 2 arid patterns, US 3 and 6-color Desert. The report, which was published sometime in 2018, remains confidential, but small bits of info were made public in April of 2019. Let's take a look at a chart from that report. Starting on the left were patterns that were the most effective and cost the least to make. As you can see, the far right has Spec4ce's Forest, meaning it was the most detectable and most expensive. However, Guy Kramer made the point to mention that the report was not provided to Hyperstealth after it was released, and when a colleague contacted the individuals who evaluated the patterns, they found that the Spec4ce pattern fared a bit better, falling closer towards the middle of the 7 as far as effectiveness. Now, when most people hear camouflage, they think of concealment by blending into one's surroundings so as to minimize your presence. However, camouflage patterns, some more than others, have something of a second use, and that is to display a level of authority, which can also lead to a degree of intimidation, but also a sense of unity or stature among its wearers. This camouflage has helped provide a sense of unity and patriotism among many of the soldiers who wear it. It has also given them a distinct look because the pattern is almost exclusively used by the ANA. So, with all of these government inquests, rebuttals, reports, and tests, has anything changed? Well, yes and no. The pattern remains in circulation as the ANA's standard issue camouflage uniform with no real updates or announcements about it being seen. Funnily enough, since the pattern's adoption, 2 additional Hyperstealth patterns have been adopted. Spec4ce's Sierra, the same pattern, but in a more arid color scheme by ANCOP, or the Afghan National Civil Order Police in late 2010, and Ghost Tech's Kilo 1, which was made in conjunction with ADS Inc., which was adopted by the APU, or Afghan Partner Unit, a Special Forces unit, in 2012. The Spec4ce's Sierra pattern was around during the initial batches of Forest being issued to the ANA and was seen on ACU-style uniforms, but was spared the strife as it was deemed more fitting for the overall environment. Now, we've really touched on only a few points surrounding this whole debacle, that being a lot of finger-pointing, reports, hearings, and so on. So if you'd like to take a look at the Seagar report and testimony video by John Sopko, we'll have the links in the description. Additionally, if and or when the 2018 report is made available to the public, we'll be sure to add it in there as well. Regardless of who you think is at fault or whether you support or condone the entire process, the pattern has already made a lasting impression on the Afghan people as well as many coalition forces within the country. Though it can be considered only somewhat optimal for the region, it has more or less achieved everything it was enlisted to do, and appears that it, at least for the time being, is here to stay. Hopefully this video has shed a bit of light on this crazy matter, but was also interesting and enjoyable. If you thought so, why not subscribe and make sure your notifications are set on, or simply check back soon for more videos right here on Uniform History.